Greetings, Ben Pearson, the Roaster Tracker. And today I want to talk to you about something a little bit different than the types of things that I normally want to talk to you about. I want to talk to you guys about critical thinking. How is it that you can actually know a reliable source? And there's a lot of reasons out there. I'm not going to name names, but let's say that someone is a skeptic, right? A skeptic is a person who doubts the common narrative. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's good to challenge the common narrative and to look for alternative ideas that are out there and consider everything, because if you have, a bunch of people that are all thinking the same kind of thing and you have somebody who comes along thinking things a little bit differently, then maybe they'll be onto something. Maybe they'll catch something that will be able to learn something and really make a big difference. But that in and of itself does not necessarily mean that all is well, that they're going to know the right thing, that they're going to be able to make a difference. What's far, far better is the concept of critical thinking. And this is where you are skeptical of the ideas, but you look for reason and truth, and you're trying to really piece things together. So how can you actually figure this out? Well, let's say that there's an idea that you're somewhat skeptical about. For this example, I'm going to take global warming because I've been doing a few videos on that subject. When I first started 15 years, 20 years ago, hearing about this, I was very, very skeptical of the whole thing, just because it seemed a little bit over the top. There were a few things that I did pretty much know. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. That's pretty easy. The levels of CO2 were definitely increasing. That's been measured by wide things. And the temperature of the Earth was warming up. That one was a little bit more in doubt. I'd heard a lot of misinformation of, well, the temperature sensors are in bad places, like in the back of airports or something like that. And at least in the early days, the northern hemisphere actually warmed up more than the southern hemisphere, which is kind of an interesting fact. Although, to my knowledge, that has actually changed. I'd have to double check that though. So I started thinking more and more about it, and the more I heard about it, the more it started to make sense, and I started to see some other forms of evidence that would support it. Now, I recently had a discussion with a friend of mine who he basically dismissed any of the evidence because, well, CO2 is good for plants, and so therefore everything must be a good thing. And is extra CO2 good for plants? Well, all other things considered, if you have higher levels of CO2, then yes, it is good for plants. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's better in all conditions. Take water, for instance. Having enough water is critical for plants, but if you have too much of it, then it can have problems. Now, CO2, the levels that would be too much would actually be, I think, quite high. I know I've seen some studies of Mars greenhouse where you had about 5% CO2, which if you were a human, you would need to have some sort of a respirator to be able to breathe that, but it'd be great for the plants. The problem is, though, is that CO2 can increase temperatures, and increased temperatures can cause an effect. The United States, I think it's Agricultural Department, has recently done an updated map of the growing zones, and the growing zones are based off of the coldest temperature that happens throughout the year. It turns out that the coldest temperature is actually rising a fair bit. This is going to cause some potential issues with growing things eventually. But for the short term, it's really probably not that big of a deal. There's more, though. When it comes to global warming, to me, the two scariest things that could potentially happen is the melting of the ice caps, primarily Greenland and Antarctica, which would cause the sea levels to rise. And to a lesser extent, but still pretty scary, is the rising acidity of the oceans, which could cause the life in the oceans to have problems. Just like if you're making a carbonated soda, you actually take compressed CO2 and you mix it in with the water, and that will cause it to become a carbonic acid, which is a relatively weak acid, but it's still an acid. And if you change the pH of the water even just a little bit, it can cause some pretty serious issues over the long term. So, this could be a problem for plant life, and it's something to be aware of and be a little bit concerned about. Personally, though, I haven't studied that side of things, but what I have studied is the melting of the ice caps, and I'm still working on a future video that will cover this in more detail, trying to understand. But the current models that we have show that if the temperature rises by 4 degrees above the pre-industrial average, then it will melt the Greenland ice cap, and that the Greenland ice cap will have enough to raise the sea level by about 15 meters, about 15-20 feet, something like that. That could cause all sorts of interesting issues. The city of Miami is almost entirely below that, so that would flood, for instance. And there's more. And if you had the Antarctic ice cap melt, which would be much higher, much harder to do, then it would melt, well, the entire state of Florida would be gone pretty much. And there's probably more than that too. So there's a lot of different things that you have to kind of balance to make all of this work and to understand it. This particular friend was a skeptic of global warming, which, like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But where his issue was is he dismissed any models because, oh, they're too complicated. We can't possibly know that. And the truth is no model is perfect, okay? There's a saying that goes, all models are wrong, some models are useful. Every model has its issues. Even, the theory of relativity is a model. Are there some issues? Yeah. But it takes digging into the details to be able to figure out what those issues are. The Big Bang Theory is a model. It works based off of all the things that we know now, but every now and then you have some issues that you have to go and discover. So one of the things that you can have to know that somebody is doing something that is worthwhile is if they are willing to accept evidence from knowledgeable people and they're willing to admit that they're wrong. If they're not willing to admit that they're wrong, then you've really got to question their source. Either they're doing tons of research and they only actually say things that they're true, which, that would be great in the real world. But more likely, they're just kind of have their head in the sand like an ostrich. I've actually heard that ostriches don't do that though, but that's beside the point. It is a lot of work to really truly know, though, what the truth is on something like this. And I think I can pretty safely say there is no question that I could come up with that has not had some kind of a study that has been done on it with regards to global warming. Like the specific example that my friend was saying, well, CO2 levels are good for plants. That's been studied. And like I said, all other things equal, it would be, but rising temperatures has an effect. The Sahara Desert, for instance, is growing larger with time. And that has a lot of different things that's doing it. The rainforests and such that are keeping it back are causing issues, and I didn't actually study that, so when I put into the video. But the Sahara Desert obviously is not very good for plants. You don't have a lot of plants that grow there, so it can cause its own issues. And you'll have more of these desert type regions in general. Now, maybe we could genetic engineer some plants that would do better with the heat. That's certainly been done. It could be done. Some of the more complex things, like will particular parts of the world fare better or worse in the event of climate change? Well, aside from the areas that'll be underwater, it's hard to really know. His friend was also very dismissive of Greenland because how could we possibly know that? But the truth is we actually have very, very good information on there. We have satellite measurements that have been shooting lasers down at the Greenland ice caps to try to measure their size, and we know how much it's shrinking every single year. We've plotted this for the last like 10-15 years, something like that, and you can see that not only is there a substantial amount of ice that's disappearing every year, that amount is growing year over year as the temperature rises, and sooner or later that entire ice cap is going to be gone, and Miami's going to be flooded, and some other low-lying areas in the world will be flooded. There'll be the island nation of Tuvalu will be flooded. The entire country, small one, but still there. It's still quite useful because it has the .tv domain name, which is pretty popular. All that being said, though, you need to look for sources that will admit that they're wrong, that look for other reliable sources that do try to refine it. And being skeptical is also a good thing. But you have to be skeptical and follow the evidence, both at the same time. There's a concept of critical thinking, which I think is a much, much higher form of knowing if something is right than being a skeptic. A skeptic is not bad. In fact, they're good. But you've really got to know. Now, in the rocket industry, there's a common skeptic, and I'm not going to say too much more than that. One of the things that's interesting, though, is this particular person seems to not look for things. He'll find people that disagree with him, and he'll just not follow them. He'll block them entirely, which is kind of sad. If you're truly going to be skeptical and really reason about the truth of things, you got to look around. You've got to see some of the other sides. There's no particular news source that I will follow exclusively, and there's none that I will admit exclusively, except for maybe stuff like tabloids that's not really meant to be serious news. I don't have any interest in that, and quite frankly, they're a little bit questionable as a whole, but any somewhat reputable news site will have some truth. I've looked at Chinese news sources, I've looked at Republican-leaning news sources, I've looked at Democratic-leaning news sources, I've looked at stuff in the middle, I look at the British press sometimes, all in an attempt to understand better what's going on in the world, so that way I can be informed and I can actually make a informed decision and be able to do something useful, to know what's going on. Now, I don't have time to do this for everything, of course, but you have to do this, especially if you're going to be posting videos on the internet of stuff. Like, do your research. Like the Common Sense Skeptic, the video that I had on here, that I went and reviewed a couple of his videos, a short summary of that is everything that he said was legitimately a challenge to getting to Mars. But he makes it sound like it's insurmountable. But they're not really insurmountable. These things will be figured out. And, for a skeptic, seeing is believing. He won't believe until you have a test flight that's around Earth that it's even possible to do that, where you're launching a rocket, having it refuel itself on Earth, and come back a year later, which is kind of crazy. You can test out the concepts required without having to do something like that. It's called systems engineering. You don't know how reliable a car is going to be. You don't build a car, drive it around for 10 years to figure out how reliable it's going to be. You build it and you test the components in different ways to be able to know if it's actually going to survive. And that's how you do these things. Not tested in exactly the same configuration. You have to know sometimes how well something's going to survive over a long period of time without having that long time. Now, going to Mars, do you have to have a full-scale mission, go to Mars and then come back to prove that it's going to work? Well, no. NASA knows about this kind of stuff. They signed on the Starship mission to demonstrate that it can land on the moon and come back home. The mission only has to land. It doesn't actually have to lift off the surface of the moon. I'd like to think I know that NASA knows what they're talking about. And if they're signed off on this, then they're presumably okay with this. Now, would it be better if it launched off the surface of the moon? Yes, absolutely, it would be. I think they'll probably even try it, but who knows? The point is, though, is you can demonstrate an awful lot of things without having every little piece tested in exactly the configuration. Now, does that mean that you should get away with not testing everything? Well, no. The Starliner capsule is a good example of that. They had tests, they did little tests in each individual piece, but the software configuration was not maintained between them. And when they combined everything together, they found out that there were some issues that they would have identified if they had done a proper test and tested everything together. So you do have to do these integrated types of tests, but they're not always exactly what you need it to be. The point is being skeptical is good, but you got to reason about your things. You got to admit when you're wrong. You got to look for reliable sources, and reliable sources, things that are published are certainly good. Things that reference published things are good. If they have a history of being right, that's good. You got to understand what the biases are. Where I'm coming as far as my bias is I like to believe that space exploration is going to get better. And so I personally do have a bias of generally saying that things are going to be better than they may actually be. Does that mean that I'm wrong? Well, maybe. And if I'm wrong, I'll fully admit it. I've posted retraction videos on here when I posted something that I found was cool based off of the latest scientific findings. And then a few weeks after that video took off, the scientist that was behind it found out that he had done the data wrong and he put a retraction. I put a retraction for that too, because it was important to know. I do try to admit when I'm wrong, and I try not to go too terribly far. Sometimes you'll have to look into the comments to figure this out when I say I'm wrong, but the fact though that you can admit when you're wrong is a good thing. And if you're going into whataboutisms, like if somebody dismisses one idea and they're like, well, what about this? What about that? You're trying to convince somebody of your particular idea and they dismiss one part of it, and then you're just overwhelming them with things. That's not actually a good way to really know if somebody is knowing what they're talking about. You've got to delve into these things and take them one piece at a time and look at them. And no person can do all of that for the entire breadth of human knowledge. So at some point in time, you have to rely on somebody. But you've got to rely on the more reliable sources, the ones that have been vetted by more people. And if you do that, then you'll be able to learn some stuff. As far as like the climate models go, look at the models that have been around since 2000. If a model that was around in 2000 was accurate in 2010, was accurate in 2020, is accurate today within reasonable noise, then that's a pretty decent sign that they've got something right. And so you can put more faith in that. Now, if the model was completely off, then, well, yeah, you don't have any faith. Where you have a bunch of models, though, that are accepted in peer-reviewed published material, and you can kind of see a trend, and you see most of them are in the same way, then that shows, hey, maybe we should take this middle ones more seriously and the extreme ones less seriously. We do this with hurricane maps. There's a bunch of different models that will predict the path of a hurricane. And you can actually plot these out now and see where this model shows that this line is. And then the weather people, the meteorologists, will kind of take an average of this and they'll show a cone based off of this. And some models are more accurate than others, but a lot of them tend to kind of converge in the middle, and you have a few that are on the outlying edges. Sometimes you have ones that are really out there. Every now and then one of those is right, but if you look through the median of things, you can get a good sense. Anywho, thank you guys so much for joining me. Let me know whatever questions or comments you guys have. I appreciate all you do, and be more critical in your thinking. Take care. We'll see you next time. Bye bye.